Henry and I were interested in, and we started to take a look, are there any international rules that apply to attacks on civilian power plants? Natural place to look is the Geneva Conventions, and at that point, all I knew about it is that when you're a prisoner, you just give your name, rank, and serial number. But it turns out there have been a number of editions. I mean, there are a lot of versions of the Geneva Conventions. And in 1977, there was something called an additional protocol that tightened up the rules on the 1949 Geneva Convention, which is kind of the basic four basic documents that when you refer to the Geneva Convention, usually refer to the 1949 version. And the 1977 additional protocol dealt specifically with attacks on nuclear power plants. It singled them out, well, along with dams, as being civilian facilities whose damage could cause a lot of civilian harm. Next slide, please. Brooke. Let me just give you a little background, because I think it's helpful to understanding kind of the general thrust of these measures to ameliorate, the awfulness of war. Really, the first one had to do with the condition of wounded in the field. The U.S. was one of the early participants. It was the middle of the 19th century, and I mentioned that at one point the U.S. was the only supporter of a proposal to expand the treaty. And I mention it because today, at least as far as this AP1, the additional protocol, which deals with nuclear power plants, we are almost in the opposite role, hanging back when lots of people have approved it. And I think that's something you might want to discuss at the end. The American Red Cross was important in ultimately getting the United States to ratify the Geneva, what was then the Geneva Convention in the 1880s. And I want to show you some pictures, which are on the next slide. This may seem a bit off the topic, and I may be reading too much into them, but I see these are from the World War I. I see in these posters kind of a different America. I mean, an American attitude toward its role, toward conflict. I mean, it's, I guess we were not a world power yet. And I don't know, more willingness, I think, to participate with others to as they said, ameliorate the effects of war. Can we go on? As I said, when you say Geneva Convention, you usually mean the four major agreements in the 1949 agreements. The fundamental idea of them is to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. And that applies to both people and things and facilities. And the aim is to spare the non-combatants. And that's principally civilians, wounded, who are no longer able to fight, and prisoners. And as I said, there were important protocols added in 1977. There were actually two of them. The one I mentioned earlier, AP1, that tightened the rules for international conflicts, and AP2, which I won't discuss, did the same thing for internal conflicts, which was a new step, really, dealing with internal, civil wars. And AP1 includes rules governing attacks on facilities whose destruction in war could cause widespread civilian harm. I'm generally using language very close to the ones actually in print, but often not exactly, just to simplify it. And of course, one of the examples is the radioactive contamination in the case of attacks on nuclear plants.